January 14th, 1888. The Nebraska Sandhills, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted like a lead weight in a dry well. By noon, the mercury had retreated past the zero mark, and by sunset, the thermometers nailed to the porch posts of the sod houses near Custer County were useless. The liquid inside had frozen solid at minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. On the ridge overlooking the frozen Middle Ope River, Elias Thorne stood atop a ladder, defying the screaming wind. In his hands was a bucket of charred, blackened, timber-crushed charcoal. He'd spent the last 3 months hauling from the site of the Great Ponderosa burn 60 miles north. He wasn't repairing his roof, he was building a second one. You're building a funeral pyre. Elias? One spark from that chimney and you'll be a cinder before the first snow hits. Calvin Drecker stood 30 feet away, his chin tucked deep into a wool scarf that was already stiff with the ice of his own breath. Drecker was a traditionalist, a man who believed if a single-layered cedar shake roof was good enough for his father in Ohio, it was good enough for the plains. To Drecker, and the rest of the starving settlement, Elias wasn't just eccentric, he was a waste of good wood. He had built a hollow 6-inch cavity over his primary roof, second roof, and was now meticulously filling that void with thousands of pounds of crushed charcoal and scorched forest debris. Elias didn't look down. He dumped the black grit into the gable opening, the dust coating his face until he looked like a coal miner in the middle of a blizzard. It's not a pyre, Calvin, Elias shouted back, his voice rasping. It's a battery, and you're standing in the path of a storm that's going to turn your cellar into a morgue. Drecker laughed, a jagged, wet sound, and turned back toward his own cabin. He represents the common consensus of 1888, that the frontier was a place to be conquered by brute force, not by thermal physics. But Elias Thorne wasn't just a homesteader. He was a man who had spent a decade as a thermal engineer for the Union Pacific, designing the insulation jackets for steam locomotives. He knew something the others didn't. He knew that wood was a poor shield, but air and carbon, they were a fortress. By midnight, the laughing stopped. The schoolchildren's blizzard had arrived, and the second roof was about to be put to a trial by ice. Elias Thorne's insight didn't come from a dream. It came from the iron bellies of the 440 American locomotives. In the rail yards, Elias watched how engineers used dead air and mineral wool to keep steam from condensing in the brutal winters of the high plains. He understood that heat isn't something you make, it's something you trap. Most pioneers built for the rain. They pitched their roofs to shed water, oblivious to the fact that they were losing 70% of their internal BTUs through the very wood meant to protect them. Elias saw the roof differently. To him, a roof was a thermal envelope. By creating a double gable design, essentially a box within a box, he was creating a thermal break. But the charcoal was the real secret. Most people saw charcoal as fuel. Elias saw it as the ultimate insulator. Charcoal is nearly pure carbon, filled with microscopic pores, millions of tiny air pockets that refuse to let heat pass through. It has a high thermal mass, but a low thermal conductivity. In the engineering world, we call this a low K-factor material. Elias was betting his life, and his entire winter stockpile of grain and cured meat, on the idea that these black rocks could hold the sun's energy long after the sun had vanished. Before we move deeper into the freezing dark of the 1888 blizzard, you need to understand that this isn't just a story about a roof. It's about the forgotten engineering of the American frontier, the kind of wisdom that kept people alive when there was no electricity to bail them out. If you want to ensure this kind of survival knowledge isn't lost to time, hit that subscribe button. We're digging into the grit of history that the textbooks left behind. The storm hit with a black frost, a phenomenon, where the humidity is so low and the temperature so extreme that the air feels like it's scouring the skin off your bones. By January 16th, the wind speeds across the Nebraska plains topped 60 miles per hour. At the Drecker homestead, 3 miles downwind, the crisis was immediate. Calvin Drecker's roof was a standard single-layer pine shingle construction. Within 4 hours of the temperature drop, the R value, the measure of thermal resistance of his ceiling, had effectively dropped to zero. The heat from his hearth rose, hit the cold wood of the roof, and conducted straight into the atmosphere. Inside the Drecker cabin, the water bucket sitting 3 feet from the stove had a inch-thick layer of ice. His livestock, huddling in the lean-to, were dying where they stood, their breath freezing in their nostrils until they suffocated. But the most devastating blow was the stockpile. Drecker had stored his winter potatoes and onions in the loft, thinking the heat from the house would keep them safe. Instead, the thermal bridge of the single roof turned the loft into a deep freeze. Thousands of pounds of food, the only thing standing between his family and starvation, turned into stones of black, frosted rot. Meanwhile, at the Thorne cabin, the scene was unsettlingly different. Elias sat at his table, a simple tallow candle burning. He wasn't wearing his heavy buffalo skin coat. He was in his shirtsleeves outside. The wind screamed, trying to find a crack in the walls, but the house remained eerily silent and profoundly warm. The second roof was performing exactly as the math predicted. During the few hours of pale, winter sunlight on the 15th, the black charcoal inside the roof had acted as a radiant absorber. even through the clouds. The dark carbon soaked up every available joule of solar energy. Now, in the dead of the -40-degree night, that charcoal was acting as a thermal battery, slowly bleeding that stored heat downward into the house. The charcoal-packed cavity wasn't just stopping the cold. It was generating a downward pressure of warm air. Elias checked his makeshift barometer. The internal temperature of the cabin was holding steady at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the fire in the hearth being nothing more than a few glowing embers. In the loft, his stockpile of salted pork and seed corn was tucked away in a constant, dry, 50-degree environment. The contrast was a matter of life and death, while the neighbors were burning their furniture just to keep their fingers from turning blue. Elias Thorne was reading a book by the light of a single candle, protected by a layer of waste wood and burnt trash. On the morning of the third day, the wind died down to a low moan. The snow was piled 6 feet high, sealing doors and windows. Calvin Drecker, his face gray with exhaustion and his hands wrapped in rags to hide the frostbite, crawled through a snow tunnel to reach Elias's ridge. He expected to find a frozen tomb. He expected to see the second roof collapsed or the house burned to the ground. When Elias opened the door, Drecker didn't speak. He couldn't. The wall of heat that hit him was so physical, so violent, that he stumbled back into the snowbank. It wasn't the smoky, choking heat of an overworked stove. It was a deep, radiant warmth, like the smell of a summer forest. Elias Drecker rasped, his eyes watering as they began to thaw. Your stove, ... How much wood are you burning? Hardly any. Calvin, Elias replied, pulling the man inside. I've burned maybe a cord since the freeze started. You, Drecker, looked at his boots. 4. And the potatoes are gone? The cellar is a block of ice. He looked up at the ceiling, the underside of that waste of wood. He could feel the warmth vibrating off the boards. It's the soot, isn't it? The black wood in the roof. Elias nodded. It's not just soot, Calvin. It's an insulation envelope. The charcoal traps the air, and the air traps the life. You called it a tinderbox. But carbon that's already been burnt doesn't like to catch fire again. It just likes to hold on to the sun. Let's look at the hard physics of why the Thorne Second Roof worked while the traditional builds failed. To understand this, we have to look at the R value per inch and the concept of thermal bridging. In 1888, a standard cedar shingle roof had an R value of approximately 1.0. If you include the stagnant air inside the attic, you might reach an R3. In a -40 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard, an R3 envelope is virtually non-existent. The heat moves through the wood via conduction. The direct transfer of energy through a solid Elias Thorne Second Roof changed the equation entirely. The air gap. By building a false roof, he created a 6-inch dead air space. Air is one of the best insulators in nature, provided it isn't moving. But charcoal fill. By filling that gap with crushed charcoal carbon, he increased the R value significantly. Modern measurements show that loosely packed charcoal has an R value of about 2.8 per inch. With a 6-inch cavity, Elias had created an R 16.8 barrier. The radiant barrier, because the charcoal was black and positioned under a secondary wooden shell. It absorbed radiant heat during the day. This is thermal mass. The math is staggering. Neighbors' heat loss. A 20 by 20 cabin with an R3 roof at -40 degrees Fahrenheit loses roughly 12,000 BTUs per hour just through the ceiling. That requires a massive, constant fire, about 5 pounds of dry oak every hour just to stay above freezing. Thorne's heat loss. With his R17 second roof, Elias reduced his ceiling heat loss to less than 2,100 BTUs per hour. Elias was burning 80% less wood than his neighbors. But more importantly, he had eliminated thermal bridging. In a normal cabin, the rafters act as a bridge, carrying heat from the warm inside to the cold outside. By burying his rafters in a quilt of charcoal, Elias broke that bridge. He didn't just have a warm house, he had a thermal vault. This is the same principle used today in rain, screen, construction, and SIP's structural insulated panels. We think we're being modern, but Elias Thorne was doing it with a shovel and a bag of burnt ponderosa pine, 140 years ago. The following spring, the mockery ended. The Thorne design didn't just become a local curiosity. It became a blueprint for survival in the Custer County area. Those settlers realized that the frontier didn't care about the way things were always done. The frontier only cared about the laws of thermodynamics. By 1890, a dozen more double-gable houses appeared across the ridge. Some men used sawdust, others used the dried corn husks, but those who wanted the best results followed Elias's lead and sought out the scorched remains of forest fires. They learned that the waste of a disaster, the burnt timber, was the very thing that could prevent the next one. Today, we call this passive solar engineering. We use high-tech polymers and fiberglass bats, but the core philosophy remains the same. Build an envelope that the environment cannot penetrate. Elias Thorne's story reminds us that on the edge of the world, the greatest tool isn't the axe or the rifle, it's the mind. The neighbors saw a waste of wood, the engineer saw a heat trap, the neighbor saw a fire hazard, the historian sees a masterclass in frontier physics. The frontier was a brutal teacher. It didn't reward tradition, and it didn't have mercy for the stubborn. It rewarded the men who could look at a pile of black soot and see a way to keep their children warm. Because in the end, survival isn't about fighting the cold, it's about outsmarting it. If you're ready to see how the pioneers used frozen mud to create a natural air conditioning system in the 100-degree summers, click the video on your screen now. We'll see you in the next one.